The Second World War was not just won on battlefields, but in factories. While German tanks rolled across Europe and Japanese carriers struck across the Pacific, a different kind of warfare was taking shape thousands of miles away in America's heartland. By 1943, the United States alone was producing more war material than all Axis powers combined. This wasn't luck or circumstance. It was the result of the greatest industrial mobilization in human history, a transformation so complete and so rapid that it would reshape the global balance of power for generations to come. When Pearl Harbor burned on December 7, 1941, the sleeping giant didn't just awaken, it transformed itself into a war machine of unprecedented scale. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet, but it also ignited an industrial response that would prove far more devastating to the Axis powers than any military defeat they could inflict. Within weeks of the declaration of war, President Roosevelt announced ambitious production goals that seemed almost fantastical: 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943. Military experts were skeptical. Industry leaders called the targets impossible. They were all proven wrong. The transformation began immediately and touched every corner of American life. Car factories that once produced Fords and Chevrolets were churning out tanks and aircraft within months. The Fisher Body Plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan, which had built car bodies, began producing M4 Sherman tanks. Ford's massive Willow Run plant, built specifically for war production, stretched over 3.5 million square feet and employed 42,000 workers at its peak. At full capacity, Willow Run produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The assembly line that Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles now built the instruments of war with the same ruthless efficiency. Shipyards that had sat dormant during the Depression were launching Liberty ships at rates that defied belief. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship before the war, revolutionized maritime construction by applying mass production techniques to shipbuilding. His yards in Richmond, California, became the symbol of American industrial might. Kaiser introduced prefabrication, welding instead of riveting, and assembly line methods that traditional shipbuilders had dismissed as impossible. The results spoke for themselves. Construction time for a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days in 1941 to an average of 42 days by 1943. The record was set by the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of what American industry could achieve. American industry didn't just support the war effort, it became the war effort. Every sector was mobilized. The entertainment industry produced training films and propaganda. The agricultural sector increased production to feed both American forces and allied nations. The mining industry worked around the clock to extract the raw materials that fed the factories. Rubber plantations in Southeast Asia had fallen to Japan, so American chemists developed synthetic rubber. Aluminum production, crucial for aircraft manufacturing, increased by 600% between 1939 and 1943. The numbers tell a staggering story that even now seems almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 300,000 aircraft of all types, from fighters to heavy bombers. They built 89,000 tanks, ranging from light reconnaissance vehicles to heavy tanks. American factories produced 3 million machine guns, 634,569 Jeeps, 2.4 million trucks, and 11,000 ships of various types. The ammunition production alone was staggering: 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 12 billion rounds of artillery shells, and 23 million bombs. To put these numbers in perspective, consider that Germany, with its vaunted industrial capacity and reputation for engineering excellence, produced approximately 67,000 aircraft between 1939 and 1945. The United States produced more than 4 times that number in just 4 years of war. American factories built more aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. This wasn't just an advantage, it was overwhelming, crushing superiority that turned the tide of war as surely as any battle. Britain, though battered by the Blitz and fighting for survival, maintained its own formidable production capacity. The British aircraft industry, dispersed and reorganized to survive German bombing, produced 132,000 aircraft during the war years. The Supermarine Spitfire, Hurricane, Lancaster Bomber, and Mosquito all rolled off British production lines in impressive numbers, despite the constant threat of aerial attack. The Shadow Factory scheme, initiated before the war, had dispersed vital production across the countryside, making it harder for the Luftwaffe to cripple British industry with concentrated bombing.
British shipyards, with centuries of naval tradition behind them, continued building warships, even as German bombs rained down on port cities. The Royal Navy, though stretched thin across global commitments, maintained its numerical advantage over the German Kriegsmarine and kept vital Atlantic supply lines open. British innovation contributed crucial technologies to the war effort, from radar improvements to jet engine development. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which powered both British and American aircraft, represented the kind of engineering excellence that kept British industry competitive despite smaller overall production numbers. Canadian factories added another significant layer to Allied production, often overlooked in the shadow of American and British contributions. Canada produced 16,000 aircraft, 50,000 tanks and military vehicles, and numerous naval vessels. Canadian shipyards built corvettes and frigates that proved crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic. The country's vast natural resources, timber, minerals, and agricultural products fed the Allied war machine. Canadian industry demonstrated that even mid-sized economies, when fully mobilized, could make substantial contributions to industrial warfare. The Soviet Union's industrial achievement was perhaps most remarkable of all, given the circumstances. When Germany invaded in June 1941, the Soviet Union lost vast industrial territories that had produced much of its steel, coal, and manufactured goods. The response was unprecedented. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, lived in harsh conditions and worked brutal hours to rebuild production capacity while German armies advanced. The results were extraordinary. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing more T-34 tanks than German factories could produce all types of tanks combined. The T-34, with its sloped armor, powerful engine, and excellent gun, was produced in numbers that overwhelmed German tactical advantages. Soviet factories built over 84,000 T-34 tanks during the war, along with thousands of other armored vehicles. The famous Katyusha rocket launcher, devastating in its psychological and physical impact, was produced in large numbers. Soviet aircraft production, though initially hampered by the loss of industrial areas, recovered and eventually outpaced German production. This Soviet achievement came at an enormous human cost, but it demonstrated that industrial capacity, once mobilized, could overcome even catastrophic territorial losses. The Soviet worker became as important to victory as the Soviet soldier. Production quotas were treated as military objectives. Workers who exceeded quotas received recognition and rewards. Those who failed faced harsh consequences. The entire society was organized around the single goal of producing the weapons needed to drive back the German invasion. The contrast with Axis industrial capacity was stark and ultimately decisive. Germany entered the war with significant industrial strength and engineering prowess, but never achieved the level of mobilization that the Allied powers sustained. German production actually increased throughout the war, reaching its peak in 1944, but it was never enough. The German economy remained partially civilian until late in the war, with consumer goods production continuing long after Allied economies had converted almost entirely to military production. Hitler's reluctance to fully mobilize German women into the workforce meant that a vast pool of potential labor remained untapped. Japan's industrial base was fundamentally inadequate for the war it chose to fight. Japanese steel production was roughly 1/10 that of the United States. The Japanese aviation industry, though capable of producing excellent designs like the Zero fighter, could never match Allied production numbers. Japanese shipbuilding, impressive in its construction of battleships and carriers, couldn't replace losses once American submarines and aircraft began systematically destroying merchant shipping. By 1944, Japan was losing the war not on battlefields, but in the factories that couldn't produce enough to sustain the fight. The Allied industrial advantage represented more than mere numbers. It reflected different economic systems, different social organizations, and different approaches to total war. The democratic Allied nations mobilized their populations voluntarily, maintained civilian morale through honest communication, and built industrial systems that could sustain themselves for years. The Axis powers, relying on conquered territories and forced labor, created production systems that were ultimately fragile and unsustainable. When the tide turned and territories were lost, Axis production collapsed. Allied production, by contrast, only accelerated. This was industrial warfare on a scale the world had never seen and would never see again. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a slogan, it was an accurate description of what the Allied nations, led by American productive capacity, had achieved. They had built a war machine that could absorb losses, learn from mistakes, and continuously improve while maintaining overwhelming quantitative superiority. This was the foundation upon which all military strategy rested, the bedrock that supported every offensive, every campaign, every victory that followed. Industrial capacity means nothing if you can't deliver the goods. The Allies didn't just outproduce the Axis, they built the most sophisticated logistics network the world had ever seen. From the factories of Detroit to the beaches of Normandy, from the ports of California to the jungles of Burma, Allied supply chains stretched across oceans and continents, feeding armies that numbered in the millions. This logistical achievement, often overshadowed by dramatic battles and bold strategies, was perhaps the most critical factor in Allied victory. Wars are won by soldiers, but soldiers cannot fight without bullets, fuel, food, and equipment. The Allies mastered the unglamorous but essential art of getting the right supplies to the right place at the right time. The Atlantic became a highway of supply, though one contested by German U-boats in a struggle that nearly strangled Britain's war effort.
Merchant ships, initially vulnerable and sailing independently, were organized into increasingly effective convoy systems that transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. Early in the war, U-boats sank merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening Britain with starvation and military collapse. The tonnage sunk in 1942 alone exceeded 7 million tons, a rate of destruction that seemed unsustainable. But the Allies adapted, innovated, and ultimately prevailed through a combination of tactical improvements, technological advances, and sheer productive capacity. The convoy system matured into a sophisticated operation involving dozens of escort vessels, aircraft coverage, intelligence gathering, and route planning. Escort carriers, converted merchant ships carrying aircraft, closed the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based planes couldn't reach. Destroyer escorts, produced in large numbers specifically for convoy protection, provided the muscle to fight back against U-boat wolf packs. Sonar and radar improvements gave Allied ships the ability to detect submarines before they could attack. Intelligence breakthroughs, including the breaking of German naval codes, allowed convoys to be routed around known U-boat positions. By mid-1943, the tide had turned decisively. U-boats that had once hunted with impunity were themselves being hunted and destroyed at unsustainable rates.
Across this turbulent maritime highway flowed the supplies that kept Britain fighting and later enabled the liberation of Europe. Merchant ships transported millions of tons of material to Britain, transforming the island into a vast military base for the eventual invasion of France. Food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, and troops all crossed the Atlantic in a stream that never stopped, despite the U-boat threat. The replacement rate for sunk vessels exceeded the loss rate, meaning that Allied shipping capacity actually increased even as U-boats continued their attacks. This was the industrial and logistical advantage in its purest form: the ability to absorb losses and continue operating at full capacity. The Lend-Lease program represented logistics on a global scale, a commitment to supply not just American forces, but Allied nations fighting the Axis. The program shipped 17.5 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union alone, despite the enormous difficulties involved in getting material to Soviet forces. These supplies traveled multiple routes, each presenting unique challenges. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk faced freezing temperatures, pack ice, German U-boats, and aircraft operating from Norwegian bases. Losses were heavy, particularly on convoy PQ-17, which lost 24 of its 35 merchant ships. Yet the convoys continued, delivering 4 million tons of supplies via the Arctic route. The Persian corridor offered a safer but slower alternative, routing supplies through Iran and up into the Soviet Caucasus. American and British forces improved Iranian infrastructure, building roads and railroads to handle the flow of material. The route delivered over 4 million tons of supplies, including thousands of trucks that proved crucial to Soviet mobility. A third route crossed the Pacific to Vladivostok, where Soviet ships collected American supplies despite the technical state of neutrality between the Soviet Union and Japan. This route handled nearly half of all Lend-Lease tonnage, though few people knew about it at the time. Soviet forces received 400,000 trucks and jeeps, fundamentally changing the Red Army's logistical capabilities. Previously dependent on horses and foot marches, Soviet units gained mobility that allowed them to exploit breakthroughs and maintain offensive momentum. The Studebaker truck became so common in Soviet service that Russian soldiers referred to all trucks as Studebakers, regardless of manufacturer.
Additionally, the Soviets received 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, and vast quantities of raw materials, including aluminum, steel, and chemicals. While Soviet propaganda downplayed this assistance, Soviet generals after the war acknowledged that Lend-Lease had been crucial to victory, particularly in maintaining mobility and providing strategic materials that Soviet industry struggled to produce.
The Pacific presented even greater logistical challenges than the Atlantic. American forces island-hopped across thousands of miles of ocean, and each island required its own supply infrastructure built essentially from nothing. Coral atolls that had been peaceful backwaters became bustling military bases almost overnight. The construction battalions, known as Seabees, built airfields and harbors on hostile islands in weeks, often under fire from remaining enemy forces. Their motto, "We build, we fight," reflected the dual nature of their mission. Seabees constructed over 400 bases across the Pacific, built 5,000 miles of roads, and moved 250 million cubic yards of earth. Floating supply depots followed the fleet, ensuring that warships could remain at sea for months without returning to major ports. Fleet oilers refueled ships at sea, allowing carriers and battleships to operate far from home bases. Ammunition ships, repair vessels, and hospital ships created a mobile infrastructure that moved with the fighting front. This flexibility meant that American forces could strike anywhere in the Pacific without being tethered to fixed bases. When the Japanese expected respite because American ships would need to return to port, those ships were instead being resupplied at sea and preparing the next offensive. Each amphibious landing required meticulous planning and enormous quantities of supplies. The invasion of Okinawa alone involved 1,300 ships carrying 182,000 troops and their equipment, plus the supplies to sustain them. Planners calculated ammunition requirements for different phases of the battle, medical supplies for anticipated casualties, food and water for the assault force, and fuel for vehicles and aircraft. Getting these calculations right meant victory. Getting them wrong meant disaster. The Allies developed supply planning into a science, using statistical analysis and historical data to predict needs with remarkable accuracy. In Europe, once Allied forces broke out from Normandy, logistics became the limiting factor on advance rates. The Red Ball Express, a truck convoy system that ran 24 hours a day from supply dumps in Normandy to forward units, became legendary for its crucial role in sustaining the advance across France. At its peak, 6,000 trucks, driven by predominantly African-American soldiers, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily, over routes that stretched for hundreds of miles. Drivers pushed their vehicles to the limit, often exceeding speed limits and ignoring rest requirements to keep the armies moving. Trucks broke down constantly but were quickly repaired or replaced. The Express demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of truck-based logistics. It could deliver enormous quantities of supplies, but consumed vast amounts of fuel doing so. Gasoline became the limiting resource as armies raced across France faster than planners had anticipated. Patton's Third Army, advancing rapidly toward Germany, began to outrun its supply lines. The decision to prioritize Montgomery's Market Garden operation meant that Patton received reduced fuel allocations, effectively halting his advance. This was logistics dictating strategy. No matter how much productive capacity existed, physically moving supplies to forward units took time and resources. The Allies eventually solved this problem by capturing and repairing continental ports, particularly Antwerp,
and by building pipelines to move fuel directly from coast to front lines. The Pluto pipeline under the English Channel eventually delivered 1 million gallons of fuel per day. Meanwhile, the Axis powers struggled with supply limitations that only worsened as the war progressed and their territorial holdings shrank. Germany relied heavily on synthetic fuel production, creating gasoline and oil from coal through chemical processes. These plants became priority targets for Allied bombers, and as they were destroyed, German mobility collapsed. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots received minimal flight training because fuel shortages meant planes spent most of their time grounded. Panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe sat immobile for lack of fuel. German logistics also suffered from an inefficient railroad system that used different gauge tracks in conquered territories, requiring constant transshipment of supplies. German forces in North Africa demonstrated the consequences of inadequate logistics. Rommel's Afrika Korps fought brilliantly with limited resources, but could never receive enough supplies to sustain major offensives. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement soldier had to cross the Mediterranean under constant Allied air and naval attack. Malta, the British island base in the central Mediterranean, became a thorn in Axis supply lines, with submarines and aircraft operating from Malta sinking a significant percentage of supplies headed to North Africa. Rommel lost battles not because of tactical failures, but because his tanks ran out of fuel and his artillery ran out of shells at critical moments. Japan's merchant fleet, critical for moving resources from conquered territories to the home islands, was systematically destroyed by American submarines in a campaign that received little public attention but proved devastatingly effective. Japanese industry depended on imported raw materials, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China. As merchant ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced, Japanese factories began to starve for materials. Oil refineries shut down for lack of crude oil. Steel mills reduced production for lack of ore. Aircraft factories slowed production for lack of aluminum. By 1945, Japanese industry was operating at a fraction of its capacity simply because raw materials couldn't reach the factories. The Japanese Navy, despite brilliant tactical successes early in the war, suffered from logistical limitations that American forces exploited ruthlessly. Japanese oilers were sunk, limiting fleet operations. Supply ships carrying ammunition and provisions were destroyed, leaving island garrisons to starve slowly. The Japanese logistics system, built for a short, decisive war, couldn't adapt to a long conflict against an enemy with superior resources. Garrisons bypassed by American island-hopping campaigns didn't surrender, they simply withered away, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The U-boat threat that had terrorized Atlantic shipping in 1942 was broken by 1943 through a combination of improved tactics, better technology, and industrial capacity. Losses that would have been crippling to Germany were merely setbacks to the Allies because shipyards could replace sunk vessels within weeks. Destroyer escorts rolled off American shipyards in assembly line fashion. Liberty ships, though slow and unglamorous, could be built faster than U-boats could sink them. The mathematics of attrition favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Germany built roughly 1,150 U-boats during the war and lost over 700 of them. The Allies built tens of thousands of merchant ships and thousands of escort vessels. Even at the height of the U-boat campaign, Allied shipbuilding exceeded losses. This was the supply chain that couldn't be broken because it was built on foundations of overwhelming productive capacity, innovative logistics solutions, and the ability to learn and adapt faster than the enemy. The Allies created a system that could absorb tremendous punishment and continue operating, that could supply forces on multiple continents simultaneously, that could maintain offensive pressure continuously. The Axis powers, fighting with limited resources and inadequate logistics infrastructure, were slowly strangled by their inability to match this logistical sophistication. The war was decided not just by who had more guns, but who could get those guns to the soldiers who needed them, along with the ammunition to fire them, the fuel to move them, and the food to sustain the soldiers using them. In this unglamorous but essential competition, the Allied victory was total.
This industrial advantage came at a cost, measured not just in dollars, but in transformed societies. The Allied victory was built on the labor of millions who never saw combat, who worked exhausting shifts in factories and shipyards, who sacrificed comfort and normalcy for years to produce the weapons that would win the war. The home front was as crucial as any battlefield, and the changes wrought by total industrial mobilization would reshape Allied societies in ways that lasted long after the guns fell silent. This was not merely economic transformation, it was social revolution disguised as patriotic necessity. American women entered the workforce by the millions, forever changing gender dynamics in ways that could never be completely reversed. Before the war, social conventions and often explicit discrimination kept most women out of industrial work. The war shattered these barriers out of simple necessity. The factories needed workers, and women were the available labor pool. By 1945, women made up 37% of the American workforce, with over 19 million women employed. 6 million of these women took jobs in industries that had previously been exclusively male domains, working as welders, riveters, machinists, and assembly line workers. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She represented millions of real women building bombers in Seattle, tanks in Detroit, and ships in California. These women worked alongside men doing identical jobs, though typically receiving only 60% of male wages for the same work. They operated heavy machinery, handled dangerous materials, and worked brutal shifts. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, women comprised a significant portion of the 30,000-person workforce building B-17 and B-29 bombers. At Ford's Willow Run, women assembled B-24 Liberators on a mile-long assembly line. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, women welded hull plates and assembled engines on Liberty ships. The social implications were profound and lasting. Women who had experienced economic independence and the satisfaction of skilled industrial work were reluctant to return entirely to pre-war domesticity. While many women were pushed out of factory jobs when men returned from military service, the cultural shift had occurred. The idea that women could not handle industrial work had been definitively disproven. Child care centers, established to allow mothers to work in war industries, demonstrated that society could accommodate working mothers if it chose to. The seeds of the feminist movement that would bloom in subsequent decades were planted in the wartime factories where women proved their capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt. The war economy employed everyone who could work, finally ending the Great Depression that had gripped the nation for over a decade. Unemployment, which had stood at 14.6% in 1940, effectively disappeared by 1943. Anyone who wanted work could find it, often at wages higher than they had ever earned before. The economic transformation was staggering. American gross domestic product doubled between 1939 and 1945, driven entirely by military production.
Federal spending increased from 9% of GDP in 1939 to 44% in 1943, an unprecedented peacetime to wartime transition that demonstrated the economic might of a fully mobilized industrial democracy. War bonds financed much of this expansion, turning ordinary citizens into investors in the war effort and the national future. Americans purchased 85 million war bonds worth $185 billion, both funding the war and controlling inflation by reducing consumer spending. The bonds also created a generation of American investors who had never owned securities before, democratizing investment in ways that would shape post-war financial markets. Rationing of consumer goods, gasoline, rubber, meat, sugar, and other commodities ensured that industrial capacity focused on military production, while teaching Americans that individual sacrifice contributed directly to victory. The Soviet Union paid the highest price for its industrial achievement, a cost measured in human suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. Soviet workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored in conditions that would have sparked revolution in peacetime. When factories were relocated east of the Urals to escape German armies, workers often arrived to find nothing but empty land. They built factory buildings while simultaneously setting up production equipment, working through Siberian winters in unheated structures, sleeping in barracks or dugouts, eating meager rations that barely sustained life. The human cost was immense, but the output was staggering and essential to survival. Soviet women comprised over half the workforce in many industries, operating lathes, driving tractors, mining coal, and assembling weapons. Entire cities became factory towns working around the clock, with 3 shifts rotating continuously. Workers who exceeded production quotas received extra rations and recognition as Stakhanovites, heroes of socialist labor. Those who failed to meet quotas faced accusations of sabotage and harsh punishment. The pressure was relentless, the conditions brutal, but the alternative was defeat and annihilation. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing more tanks than Germany, a remarkable achievement for a nation that had lost much of its industrial heartland to invasion. Soviet tank production exceeded 28,000 units in 1943 alone, compared to German production of approximately 10,000. Soviet aircraft production similarly outpaced German output, with over 34,000 aircraft built in 1943. Artillery, ammunition, and small arms poured from Soviet factories in quantities that allowed the Red Army to maintain offensive operations continuously after the Battle of Kursk. This production came at tremendous human cost. Malnutrition, exhaustion, industrial accidents, and exposure claimed countless lives. Soviet workers were casualties of the war as surely as soldiers at the front, though their sacrifices received less recognition. Britain exhausted itself financially to maintain the war effort, a burden that would reshape the nation's position in the world. The nation that had entered the war as a global empire, the world's creditor and financial center, would emerge victorious but economically depleted, dependent on American loans and facing the dissolution of its colonial holdings. British war expenditure totaled approximately £25 billion, roughly 4 times the nation's pre-war GDP. Britain liquidated overseas investments, borrowed heavily from Commonwealth nations and the United States, and mortgaged its financial future to sustain the war effort. The pound sterling's dominance gave way to the American dollar as the world's reserve currency, a shift formalized in the Bretton Woods Agreement that reshaped the international financial system. British gold reserves were depleted, flowing to the United States to pay for supplies before Lend-Lease began. Even after Lend-Lease started, Britain incurred debts that would take generations to repay. The final payment on British war debt to the United States wasn't made until 2006, more than 60 years after the war ended. This financial exhaustion meant that Britain could not maintain its empire in the post-war world, leading to rapid decolonization that transformed the global political landscape. British civilians endured rationing that would continue long after the war ended, a sacrifice that kept armies supplied and fighting. Food rationing began in 1940 and didn't fully end until 1954, nearly a decade after victory. Meat, sugar, butter, cheese, eggs, and many other staples remained strictly controlled. Clothing was rationed, using a points system that encouraged repair and reuse rather than purchase of new items. Fuel was rationed, limiting heating and transportation. British civilians accepted these privations with remarkable stoicism, understanding that every resource diverted to civilian use was a resource unavailable for the military.
The social changes in Britain paralleled those in America, with women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers and taking on roles previously reserved for men. British women served in military auxiliary services, worked in munitions factories, drove buses and ambulances, and staffed farms through the Women's Land Army. Unlike in the United States, where many women were pushed out of industrial work after the war, Britain's continued economic difficulties meant that women's labor remained essential. The welfare state that emerged in post-war Britain, including the National Health Service, established in 1948, reflected lessons learned during the war about government's capacity to organize and provide for its citizens. The Axis powers never achieved this level of industrial coordination or social mobilization, a failure rooted in ideology, strategic miscalculation, and economic limitations. Germany's production actually peaked in 1944 under Albert Speer's rationalization of war industry, but by then it was far too late to affect the war's outcome. German monthly aircraft production reached 3,000 units in 1944, impressive but still dwarfed by Allied production. The increases came despite strategic bombing that destroyed factories and disrupted supply chains, demonstrating what German industry might have achieved if fully mobilized earlier in the war. Hitler's decision to wage war on multiple fronts, combined with ideological reluctance to fully mobilize German women into the workforce, meant that German industry operated below its potential capacity until late in the war. Nazi ideology celebrated women as mothers and homemakers, discouraging their employment in heavy industry. While German women did work in increasing numbers as the war progressed, the mobilization came too late and never matched Allied levels. Germany also relied heavily on slave labor from conquered territories, workers who had no incentive to produce quality goods and who engaged in sabotage when possible. This workforce was brutalized, malnourished, and deeply unwilling, creating inefficiencies that German supervisors could never entirely overcome. Strategic bombing steadily degraded German production capabilities despite Speer's efforts. While individual raids often failed to destroy their targets, the cumulative effect of thousands of bombing missions devastated German infrastructure. Transportation networks were shattered, making it impossible to move raw materials to factories or finished goods to the front lines. Oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants were systematically destroyed, crippling German mobility.
Ball bearing plants, crucial for mechanical production, were bombed repeatedly. By 1945, German industry was collapsing, not from lack of factories, but from lack of raw materials, transportation capacity, and, increasingly, workers, as men were drafted into the shrinking Wehrmacht. Japan entered the war with a manufacturing capacity roughly one-tenth that of the United States and saw its already limited industrial base systematically destroyed by 1945. Japanese industry had always been constrained by the island nation's lack of natural resources, depending on imports for virtually all raw materials. When American submarines severed the shipping lanes connecting resource-rich, conquered territories to Japanese factories, the industrial base began to starve. By 1944, Japanese steel production had dropped to less than half of its 1941 levels. Aircraft production, which had peaked at approximately 2,500 units per month in 1944, collapsed to barely 1,000 units per month by mid-1945. American strategic bombing accelerated this decline. B-29 superfortress raids burned Japanese cities to the ground, destroying both factories and the workers who staffed them. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city, including numerous small factories and workshops that comprised much of Japanese industrial capacity. Similar raids devastated other major cities, while precision bombing and naval mining closed ports and destroyed what remained of Japanese shipping. By August 1945, Japanese industry was effectively non-functional, unable to produce the weapons needed to resist invasion. The industrial advantage wasn't just about quantity, though quantity mattered enormously. Allied forces benefited from standardization, mass production techniques, and continuous innovation that the Axis could not match. The Sherman exemplified this approach, not individually superior to German heavy tanks, but reliable, easy to maintain, produced in enormous numbers, and continuously improved throughout the war. The Sherman's reliability meant that formations could maintain operational readiness better than German units equipped with technically superior but mechanically unreliable Panthers and Tigers. America could build 5 Shermans for every Tiger Germany produced, and those Shermans would be in action while Tigers sat broken down awaiting parts that never arrived. When Allied tanks were destroyed, they were replaced within days, often with improved models incorporating lessons from combat. German losses were increasingly permanent as production capacity declined and supply chains collapsed. This mathematics of attrition, brutal and unglamorous, decided battles as surely as tactical genius. Superior numbers, adequate quality, and reliable logistics defeated technical excellence unsupported by industrial capacity. This was the reality that decided the war, a reality visible in production statistics, shipping manifests, and supply requisitions, rather than in dramatic battlefield photographs. Courage, strategy, and sacrifice all mattered immensely, but industrial capacity provided the foundation for victory. The Allies could afford losses the Axis couldn't. They could experiment, fail, learn, and try again, because the factories would simply build more equipment. They could supply armies on multiple continents simultaneously, maintaining pressure everywhere, while the Axis scrambled to defend anywhere. The Allied nations had achieved what no military alliance had ever accomplished before: the complete industrial mobilization of the world's most productive economies, all focused on a single goal and sustained for years despite enormous costs. They transformed societies, empowered previously marginalized groups, bankrupted treasuries, and sacrificed normal life for the duration. The price was high, paid in exhaustion, privation, and transformed social structures. But the alternative was unthinkable, and so the factories ran around the clock, the ships sailed through submarine-infested waters, and the workers built the instruments of victory, one rivet, one weld, one tank at a time. In the end, the Axis powers didn't just lose battles, they were simply overwhelmed by an enemy that could produce, ship, and replace war material faster than they could destroy it. The outcome was never truly in doubt once the industrial mobilizations reached full capacity. The only questions was how long it would take and what the cost would be. The answers were written in factory output numbers and cargo manifests long before they appeared in battlefield communiques.